And welcome back. In this video, we're going to implement source address translation. On the initial flow of traffic, we're going to swap out the source address. We're going to overload on the egress interface, or a pool of addresses there, which makes it PAT. And we get to implement the address translation on the individual security policy entries as part of the configuration. So let's take a quick peek at the topology, confirm our plan, and then I'll walk you through the configuration and verification of source address translation leveraging PAT. So we'll use firewall 1. We'll say anything that's sourced from the 10 address space. If it's being routed in on port 2 and out of port 4 based on the routing table here on firewall 1, then we want to swap out those source addresses and let's map them to something out here in this global address space, which is currently in my lab environment. So I have total control of all the addresses here. .1's here, .71's here, .74's here, but we can use anything else. So let's go ahead and use port address translation using the last two octets of .208 or 209. We also can do this with just one IP address because it'll support thousands and thousands of overloads on one address. But I think we have two in the pool that'll help reinforce the concept that it's actually able to map multiple devices to either of these IP addresses on the outside. And as we implement this on firewall 1 in this video, we are going to implement that address translation on the individual security policy entries on firewall 1. So with that in mind, let's go to the GUI for firewall 1. All right, here is firewall 1 in the upper left-hand corner. It says that. And also, let's just take a peek at the routes just to make sure we're on the right device as well. And if we click on the routing widget, here is our routing table. Super, we've got our default route and a whole bunch of directly connected networks as well. Also, on these interfaces, I'm going to rename them just a little bit so it's a little easier to make sure we get the right interface. And to do that, I'm going to click on the network section here and go to interfaces. So the name management is great, DMZ is great. I'm going to label 2ISP, that's port number 4. I'm going to label that outside just to help me remember that port 4 leads to the outside world. So we'll go ahead and double click on that. And it's going to change the alias here to outside, meaning it's facing the outside networks. Click OK. And then port 2, which is the inside interface that leads off to firewall 2 and firewall 3, I want to rename that as well. I'm going to go ahead and just call that inside. And click on OK. Now, as we set this up, we're going to go to policies and objects, and we are going to implement this as part of the firewall policy. Now, if we want to point to a pool of addresses for the address translation, right here, we can click on IP pools. We can create one. However, right here from the firewall policy, it also gives us the option of jumping out for a moment, creating an IP pool that we can then define there as well. So here in the firewall policy, we already have a security policy, this rule right here, which is called allow everything. I'm going to go ahead and double click on that to edit it. And I'm going to rename that inside to outside, just to help remind me of what it does. So that's allowing traffic from in to out, coming from the inside, going to the outside. And as far as the source, right now it's set to all. If we want to make that a little more restrictive, instead of saying all, I'll go ahead and remove that. I'm going to click on the plus symbol. And then over here, I'm going to go ahead and create a new address object, which refers to the 10 anything network. So I'm going to click on create, and I want to create an address object. And so I'm going to call this 10 anything. And we can specify the color if we want to. I'll go ahead and make that that color green. And for the type, subnet or IP range. So let's go ahead and just say subnet, and let's say the 10.000/8, which represents anything sourced with a 10 address in the first octet is going to match. And for the interface, I'll leave that as any, and I'll click on OK. So now we have this 10 anything object. I'm going to specify that as the source. That locks it down just a little bit. So any traffic that's coming from the 10 anything address space and going to anywhere for the destination, this is the rest of the internet. And then for the service, I'm also specifying all, which basically means the users are allowed to send any traffic they want. It could be ICMP, it could be HTTP, HTTPS, TCP, UDP traffic. It doesn't matter. This security policy is allowing everything here, and the action is accept. And then we scroll down. This is where we implement the address translation as part of this security policy entry. So currently, we're using the outgoing interface, which indeed is port address translation. So right now, traffic that comes in on port 2 and is being routed out port 4 based on the routing table of the firewall, it's going to swap out the source IP address from the client and overload the existing outgoing or egress address, which is 23.1.2.72 here on firewall 1. And if we wanted to refer to a pool of addresses for the address translation, we could go ahead and select this. And then from this point, it also gives us the opportunity to create a pool if we don't yet have one. So let's use a dynamic pool. We'll click on plus here to reference the pool. There's no entries up here for a pool. No worries. We'll click on create and let's call this pool for Pat on outside. And then for the range of addresses, let's go ahead and specify 23.1.2.208 based on our plan through 23.1.2.209. And then overload is selected by default. That means if we have 100 clients that need to be translated, their source addresses, it's going to use these two addresses on the outside for those translations. And it's up to the firewall in this case to choose which of the addresses it's going to choose. But in either case, it's overloading. So we could have hundreds or thousands even of internal source addresses being translated, and it will do the translation of that source address into one of these two addresses. If we were doing source network address translation, not port address translation, we could say 1-to-1 here, and then this would support exactly two hosts being translated. So for this demonstration, we want to overload, and we'll go ahead and click on OK. And then we'll go ahead and drag and drop that pool down here. By default, the firewall is reserving the right to change the source ports if it needs to during the translation. But if for some reason we wanted to force the same exact source port that the client was using as it goes out, we could force it here. So if we leave it unchecked, it gives the firewall more options as far as what ports it has to play with when it's doing the translations. And then everything else, we can go ahead and leave at their defaults and click on OK. So right here under the NAT column, it's showing us that we are doing address translation. So if we hover here, which is really cool, it shows us not only the pool name, but also the type, which is overload, meaning Pat, and also the two IP addresses in that range. And if we wanted to modify it, we could go ahead and click on edit and modify it right here. So with that in place, how do we verify this? Let's take a look at our topology. What I propose we do is let's bring in a few devices right here on the 10.123 network. We already have DHCP services being provided, so we should be able to bring in multiple devices here and then send traffic out to the internet from them. And we should see that translation happening to either 208 or 209. And at least two of these devices, and maybe all three even, are going to be sharing the same address on the outside as they go through the port address translation. It's up to the firewall to choose which source address is going to go ahead and be assigned to which translated address. So let's bring in some devices on this 10.123 network. And it just so happens that we have the tools to do it. So this is the ESXi interface for the hypervisor. And let's see here. Oh, let's do this. Let's go down to networking and click on port groups. And let's see who's connected currently to this port group called FG10123. I'll go ahead and click on that. There we go. So this is going to be easier than I thought. We could pick any of these devices and use them as DHCP clients on the inside because they're already connected to this port group. Effectively, they live on that 10.123 network. So let's go ahead and let me right click on Tiny2. And let me go ahead and power that on. And let's go to this FG Linux client, right click. I've got a snapshot for that. Let's see here, let me manage it. Oh, he's got a static address on the 10.123. That'll work. That'll work as long as he has a good default gateway. So we'll go ahead and let's select that and restore that snapshot. Click on restore, close that. And let's also bring up a Windows 10 machine on the inside here. So we'll go to snapshots. Oh, no snapshot there. So we'll just power it on. Great, great, great. And I also have a Kali Linux box on the inside. So let's bring him up as well. We'll bring up 4 devices here. So we'll right click, go to snapshots. And let me just take a look at the details for that snapshot real quick before I use it. Right click, snapshots, manage snapshots. Oh, that's from a long time ago. So I'm just going to power it up. And that way he can get a current IP address. So let's right click on Kali Linux. And I'll just power it on. And let me refresh this page. And great. So all those little virtual machines are now running, and they'll give us more opportunity to verify the address translation that's happening through the firewall. So again, back at the topology, as these devices forward traffic out to the internet, we would expect all of their source IP addresses to be swapped out into one of these two addresses in the pool with the port address translation. So let's bring some of those devices in. Here's the Linux client. Let me go to command prompt with an ifconfig. All right. Oh, 10.123.0254. And let's do a ping. Okay. All right. It's got connectivity. It's good to go. Fantastic. So that's one device that we can use. Let's bring in the tiny Linux right here. Let's do a trace route to 8888. It says unreachable. Let's do ifconfig. Yeah, it is not getting an IP address. So I'm going to go ahead and put that guy on hold because I just really need 3 devices to test with. And here is a Windows computer. So we'll log in here. And while that's logging in, let's go ahead and grab my Kali Linux box as well. So this is another device on the inside on that 10.123 network. All right, and let's just check out our addresses. So here at the Windows computer, we'll go to a command prompt and we'll type ipconfig. And sure enough, it got an IP address. Good, good, good. Oh, you know what? I think we have a reservation for it. That's why it got that 161 from our previous videos. Let's do a ping out to 8888. That looks good. Let's go to our Linux box and let's do an ifconfig. All right, 10.123.0.152. All right, so let's confirm what we have. We have, on this Linux machine, we've got 10.123.0.254. So I'm just going to make a note of that on paper here. And then on the Windows client, it is at 161. And the Kali Linux box is at .152. All right, so let's generate some traffic to the internet from all those. We'll bring up a browser on each. And on the Kali Linux box, let's go to www.fortinet.com. All right, that looks pretty good. Let's go to the Windows machine, open up a browser there. From here, let's go to cisco.com. All right, that looks good. And then from the generic Linux box here, let's go ahead and yet open up another browser. So we'll bring up Chrome here. And let's go to cbtnuggets.com. Great, 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 great. All right, so what I'm going to do as we do these tests is I'm going to hit refresh on all of these so we have traffic that's current from all three devices on the inside. And I'm going to bring them off to a separate window. All right, so now let's go down to Firewall 1 and let's take a look at Firewall 1. So here on Firewall 1, if we go to the dashboard and we go to Network and we click on the DHCP widget, I was thinking we should have 3, but the reason we have 2 is that one of those is hard-coded. So we have the addresses of .152, which is our Kali Linux box. I've got my Windows 10 machine at .161, and then we have the other generic Linux box at 254, which is hard-coded. It's not a DHCP client, and that's why we're not seeing it here. But all of them have access to the internet. So one way, and it's a pretty darn good way of seeing the translations that are currently in use, is at the CLI. So we could either click right here for a command line interface, or I currently have secure CRT that's open to Firewall 1. And let me do a refresh on all 3 virtual machines on their browser, which I'm doing right now. And then at the firewall, we'll do a get system sessions and a question mark and list. All right, enter, boom. So what this is giving us is a list of all the current sessions involved on this firewall, including traffic that's being routed through the firewall. And let me scroll up a little bit so we can see the headings here for each of these columns. So here we have the source address, the destination address. If source NAT is involved, we have the source NAT. And if destination NAT is involved, which we don't have yet, the destination NAT information goes right here. So if we look for our 3 machines, so here's an example of one right here. I'll just go ahead and put a line under 254, a little mark right here. That's our generic Linux box. Then we have 161. 161 is our Windows machine. And our Kali Linux box is at 152. I didn't plan on it this way, but by George, those are all back-to-back right there next to each other. So as far as source NAT, it decided, because we gave it 2 IP addresses to play with, it mapped them both over to the globally routable address of 208. While for this address, the internal address of 161, which is our Windows machine, it chose on its own power, it chose to map it to 209 on the outside. So because our pool had 208 and 209, the firewall gets to choose with port address translation with overloading about which of those IP addresses it's going to use as new translations are being built and set up. And let's talk about a few of these other values as well. For the source IP address, that's pretty straightforward. And this number right here is the source port that was in use. And then when the firewall did the translation, it swapped out this source IP address for this source IP address, and it chose to use this same source port. Now, it didn't have to, because we didn't say force using the same source port, but the firewall chose to use the same source port on both sides. If it had changed the source port, when the reply traffic came back, it would untranslate that port as well, so that when the PC receives it, it has no idea, it just knows it got a response. And then for the destination, this is a DNS request because it's going to 8888, and it's using port 53, specifically UDP port 53, which is used for DNS requests. And then down here, we have some examples of TCP, which are being used based on the destination well-known port of 443. That would be an example of using some flavor of HTTPS. Whether it's TLS version 1.x or an older SSL flavor, TCP destination port 443 is the well-known port for that. So in this video, we've implemented, based on our plan, source address translation, specifically with overload. So effectively it's source pat, and it's dynamic because the translations are built on demand when the clients initially send traffic that needs to be routed through the firewall. Now, the other option in implementing the same scenario is instead of using NAT configuration on each of the security policy entries, the other option is to use centralized NAT with a central NAT policy. And that's what we're going to do in the very next video. So I'll see you there in just a moment. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.